Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Glad you're here. As most of you know from last week, we have memory verses. We will start today with our first one. If you've had the opportunity to memorize it, that's great. If you haven't, you can read it. It's Romans 10:17. And we're going to start right now. Now, one thing I want to mention, oftentimes I hear today this quoted in various places, and they leave out the first two words. So then, let's always remember that every word in this Bible comes from God. It comes off His tongue. And so we don't want to be taken away, and we don't want to be added to. We have admonitions in Deuteronomy 4, Joshua 1, 7a, at the end of Revelation, about the consequences if we add or subtract from God's Word. So we'll start right now. Let's do this in unison. Ready? So then, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Everybody got an A. It's fantastic. Thank you. And this is going to be cumulative, so it gets a little more difficult. The degree of difficulty increases each week. But next week is John 17:17. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. So that'll be the verse for next week, and we'll do both. We'll do the first one and the second one next Wednesday morning, Lord willing. All right, now, for those of you that weren't here, those that weren't here last week, and those that are here, I just want to quickly do a little review. And I try to start off with something we know about. We talked about this last week. Just for our information purposes, you see this where my pointer is. This little place called, I'm not sure whether that's Adana or Dadna, but Turkey, this place right here is the approximate location of where Tarsus was. Okay? Now you'll notice, let me zoom this in for you a little bit. Okay, Ephesus here is still about the same place. One thing is very interesting. Neither Ephesus nor Tarsus were seaports. They were ports. They were port cities. Ephesus was about 8 or 10 miles inland. In fact, they had to dredge that river to make access continuous. In the case of Tarsus, it was known as the Tarsus River, and Saul of Tarsus was born about 10 miles inland from the Mediterranean Sea. So he was born in a port city, but it was not a port of the Mediterranean Sea. Again, just for review, let's go back and look at what we started with last week. Just for the folks who weren't here, that's the provinces. That's an ancient map. Here's the Roman Empire at its height. We talked somewhat about this. Now, keep in mind that these maps are made by people, and they make mistakes. You'll find mistakes on the internet, and you'll find mistakes in a map like this that is not known at that time as Asia Minor. Asia Minor didn't come around until about the 5th century AD. So it's about 6 AD before this peninsula, which is the westernmost protrusion of the continent of Asia, but it was not known as Asia Minor until much later than this time. At this time, it is only known as the Anatolian Peninsula. Here's an ancient map giving us an overview. Again, just for way of review, this is the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Cyprus, here's Crete. I did this for a couple of reasons. One is to recognize the Anatolian Peninsula. Also, I want us to remember the Pontic Mountains on the north side of this peninsula, present-day Turkey. And I want us to remember the Taurus Mountains on the southern side of this peninsula, because Paul and Silas have to climb over these mountains to get to the area of Galatia, which is right in this area right here. Then as the Romans conquered eastward, they came from Greece across the Aegean Sea and, of course, they hit this peninsula and they started conquering and naming the area, as most conquerors do. And it makes sense that the first province they named was the first place they hit, the area of Ephesus. And so Asia was the province that they named first. Then they went on eastward as they conquered and named these other provinces. The one we're really interested in and headed for right now is Cilicia, because that is the birthplace of Saul. Let's see if you see this, you look closely, you see a river right here. Okay? That is, at that time, the Tarsus River. And Tarsus was located up about 10 miles inland from the Mediterranean Sea. And one other point I want to make, again, you find a lot of mistakes when you go out in the internet and places like that. A lot of good information there, but you got to be cautious. You got to dig. One of the things I want to mention, this word Asia is mentioned about 21 or 22 times in the book of Acts. Okay? Now, when that word Asia is mentioned, it's talking about the Roman province of Asia. It's very important. It's difficult in this type of a study. The difficulty is making our minds to go back. We've got to get our minds to go back. We want to go back before Turkey. We want to go back before Asia Minor. We're going to go back to the Anatolian Peninsula. And that's what this was called at the time. Peninsula, because it's mostly almost totally surrounded by water. But you'll notice the various provinces you read in your Bible, Pontus, Bithynia, Laconia, and so on. Now, one thing I want to mention this morning was that Saul of Tarsus was born about 3 A.D., okay? He was born about 3 A.D. in Tarsus. Now that makes him a contemporary of Christ. But we don't think of that way often. But he was a contemporary of Christ. They're in different parts of the world, different parts of the Asian continent. But at that time, Saul of Tarsus is going to take this trip we're going to be talking about this morning. And as Saul of Tarsus was studying the Torah in Jerusalem, Jesus was a carpenter in Nazareth. We don't think about that like that too often, do we? But that's exactly what was going on. We got Saul of Tarsus studying at the feet of Gamaliel, and we got Jesus being a carpenter in Nazareth. And that's going on simultaneously. So they were contemporaries. We talked about the Roman Empire last week. We won't spend a lot of additional time on that. I do want to mention one thing, a repeat from last week. The Romans built it's about 500 miles from Ephesus, which is just outside of our map. It's about 500 miles from Ephesus to Tarsus. The Romans built a road from Ephesus, and that road didn't go through Tarsus, but it was just north of Tarsus. Kind of like 581 and 81. So they built the road and continued on east with it. And they went down to Palestine as well with that road. So when that road left Tarsus, it went eastward over the mountains and went down to Palestine. So that was the kind of a road work we had. And Ephesus turned out to be a tremendous crossroads. See? Think about Europe and Asia coming together for the first time in the world, commercially. They're coming together the first time. So you got Europe, and it's where East meets West. This is what we got in Ephesus. To give us an idea of how come Ephesus turned out to be such a booming commercial center as Tarsus did. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Let's look down. Again, as I mentioned last week, I'm trying to take us to the roots of this man, young man, Saul of Tarsus. I want to take us to the roots. Let's look at the climate. We talked a little bit about the location geographically. Let's look at the climate of present-day South Central Turkey. Okay? Very hot summers, chilly, damp winters, and I mentioned the road, and of course the Ephesus. Keep in mind, Ephesus turned out to be a primary trading center because of its strategic location. Now, the Tarsus merchants, they came across, I mentioned they had a chance to go stop at Tarsus and do business. They could go east of the mountains, or they could take their trade goods on the road that they built down to Palestine. Now, let's look for a minute at the educational assets of Tarsus. Tarsus was known as a Little Athens, was a nickname for Tarsus. Little Athens, because of, became such a tremendous learning center of education. First of all, what did Tarsus have? It had a university. Okay? Number two, it had a school of philosophy. Greek, philosophy, and poetry. I got a couple of verses. These are rather obscure, and you may miss this. I have for many years until I started in-depth study. But let's look at Acts 17:28. And Mike, I'll get you to read Acts 17:28. And John, Beck, would you look at Titus 1 and verse 12? Titus 1 and verse 12. Acts 17:28. You folks will turn to these as we'll have Mike read 17:28. And I'll give you all just a minute to turn to 17:28 because I want you to follow and pick up on the philosophy and the poetry that's mentioned by Paul. Okay, now, Mike, Acts 17:28.
For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own prophets have said, for we are also his offspring.
And some of your own prophets that trained at the university. Okay, Titus 1:12, John. Let just a second, John. Let's let everybody turn to Titus 1:12. I'll give you just a few seconds. Titus 1 and verse 12. Okay, John.
One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy blood.
All right. So there, if you need a couple verses to help you understand. Now let's look at this. That's the educational assets. A tremendous educational environment that this young man Saul was raised in. Now let's look at the commerce. One of the main things in terms of commerce was the Cilician cloth. The goat's hair cloth that was manufactured in Tarsus was the highest quality of that day, made for tent material and sailing vessel sails. Okay? So it was known around that part of the world, and Cilician's goat's hair cloth, and we know from Acts 18:3 that he was a tent maker. I suppose if you've got that noted in your Bibles, if you don't, you need to note Acts 18:3, because we have to go we have to go that far into Acts to find out that his trade, what was his trade? And that's what it was. Aquila and Priscilla. Okay, now another Cilician cloth, another part of their commerce was linen. Now that was probably a spin-off from the commercial grade of the cloth they made for the sails and tents. But linen was another biggie in the commerce of Tarsus. And the third of the three that I'm aware of is lumber. It took a lot of wood to build a ship, didn't it? So the lumber industry was thriving and booming in Tarsus. And again, keep in mind, it's kind of like 81, okay? And the nightmare 81. So I don't think that this was a nightmare, but that highway, okay, for commerce. If you travel, if you have the misfortune of traveling on Sunday afternoon and Sunday night on 81, or Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday night, it's bad all the time, but those two times are horrible because the fellows are coming. I had a trucker member of the church tell me years ago, I said, what's going on Sunday night? And I'm trying to get to church. And what's going on Wednesday night? He said, Wayne, the truckers take their first load of the week, and they're coming from everywhere down south, right? Going north. The truckers take their first trip on Sunday. They go back home and they take their second trip on Wednesday. So, see how fortunate we are. Sunday night and Wednesday night. So think of that in terms of this highway, because that's just how busy it was. Military and commerce. Now, for you ladies, we've got a love story. Most of you know or may remember, Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. And Mark Antony became half ruler of the Roman Empire in 41 BC. Now, this is documented. Mark Antony sent word to Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt, richest woman in the world at that time. He asked her for a date. Mark Antony asked Cleopatra for a date. And he asked, let's meet in Tarsus. Well, Cleopatra came up the Tarsus River, that 10 miles. And can you imagine that barge being ornate with gold and silver? No telling what all. Lavishly decorated vessel as she goes up the Tarsus River to meet Mark Antony in Tarsus. And they met and walked hand in hand into the city of Tarsus. There's no extra charge for that. All right, now let's move on. Now let's summarize about this young man Saul. What about him? Well, number one, we know his religion was Jew, don't we? Okay, but there's a lot to that. First of all, he was the son of a Pharisee, Acts 23:6. If you want to know his credentials as a Jew, they are Acts 23:6, son of a Pharisee, of the straightest sect, Acts 26:5, and a Hebrew of Hebrews, Philippians 3:15. Now that's Acts 23:6, Acts 26:5, and Philippians 3:5. Now his father and mother were native Jews, so if I can put it in our vernacular today, Saul was a card-carrying Jew. I mean, he was right down the line 100% Jew, and proud of it. Now, let's look at his culture. We looked at his religion a little bit. Let's look at his culture. What was Saul's culture? Number one, he was a Greek. How was that? In terms of culture, Greek was a part of the world. The Greek language was the language of the day. We know about the university, education. Oh, he was surrounded with educational opportunity as he grew up. Now, and being in that port city, of course, I always try to think of this because I can relate to this personally. Being raised on a river, here's little Saul at Tarsus. You can just imagine this. 3 or 4 years old. What's he want to do? He wants to go down and see the ships coming in. He wants to see the ships coming in and going out. Right? Things change, don't they? When I was that age, guess where we went on Sunday afternoon? We went to the airport to watch the planes take off and land. That was a big deal. You know, they all flew below 10,000 feet because none of them were pressurized. They gave you chewing gum when you got on the plane so your ears would kind of get carried up. So here's Saul at Tarsus, and I would go down to the dock and wave sadly to my dad goodbye as he left Norfolk and sailing on a vessel of the Merchant Marines. So I can relate to that. And it's a wonderful thing. Children, young and we adults like to see the aircraft carry Ronald Reagan coming in, don't we? Well, so here's little Saul at Tarsus going down to being taken by his parents, watching the ships go in and out. So that was his culture. Now, we talked about his religion. We talked about his culture. Let's talk about his citizenship. His citizenship, of course, was he was a Roman. Meaning he couldn't be scourged or crucified and was guaranteed due process. Now, we'll see this often as we get into the study, we see him have to remind the Roman officials a couple times, don't we? Yeah, a couple times. He reminds them, hey, you're doing the wrong thing because I'm a Roman citizen. Now, it's interesting to note on Wayne Jackson's commentary on page 288, he says later, much later, if they had gone through the process of due process and were found guilty, at a later, much later date, scourging was allowed to them. But at this time, they could not be scourged, and they are guaranteed due process by being a Roman. So there's an idea of his background as much as I can find. Now, I want to look at the title of this section of our study is the early travels of Saul. And I want to go to we've got a handout. Richard's going to give you this handout right now. And it pertains to his first travel. Now, you'll notice on this handout, when you get it, thank Richard for passing that. You'll notice I made some corrections. Just like I mentioned on the map of the Roman Empire, Asia Minor. Well, this map is made by men, so I've got some corrections on it. And so just keep that in mind. That's why those corrections are there. And, this map has got an arrow, the one you're being handed out right now, and I've got Paul scratched out, and I've got Saul. I want to call this man what God calls him. Is that right with y'all? I want to call him what he's called by God. And at this time in his life, he is called Saul. Saul of Tarsus and then Saul the Apostle. Okay, got your hand out now. Now, he made a pilgrimage at this age, probably, historians tell us, about 14 or 15 years old. He makes a journey from Tarsus, his home, and he goes down to Jerusalem. Now, think about this. Here's a young teenager, and his parents are sending him to Jerusalem. That's about a 350-mile trip. It's about 300 miles from Tarsus to Caesarea. It's about 50 miles from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So this young man's going to make a 700-mile round trip. So approximately, the best I can determine from scholars, is about a 2-year program at the feet of Gamaliel to study the Torah, the Jewish law. Now, to give you the background on this, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, if you had a son who was academically inclined, and those of you that are parents, you know by 10 or 12 anyway, maybe before, you'll know whether or not a youngster is academically inclined or not. Some are not, which is fine. You make a good living as a carpenter or a welder or whatever. Blue collar. We'll call it blue collar. However, if you had a son as a Jew who was academically inclined and you could afford it, you would send this young man to Jerusalem to study the Torah, the Jewish law, at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, most of you know about Gamaliel. I've always been amazed at this. I did this for the Wednesday night group. But you could study, let's say you set out to study Saul. You want to study Saul. And you study Acts, you start Acts. And you get Acts 11 and 12, and 13 and 14 and 15 and 16 and 17. And you study, and you think by Acts 21, chapter 21, you got a pretty good understanding of this man, don't you? He's about on his third missionary journey. He's about 60 years old. But you don't have the rest of the story. What's the rest of the story? Well, look at Acts 22:3. It tells you there that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Then you begin to think, well, where did I miss this? Well, you didn't miss it because that's the first record of it. So then you go backwards and you study the juvenile part of this young man. And that's when you find that he was sent by his parents, his loving parents, to Jerusalem to study at what is known as the second greatest rabbi in the history of the Jewish people to that time. His grandfather, Gamaliel's grandfather, whose name was Hillel, H-I-L-L-E-L, I think it's Hillel, H-I-L-L-E-L. His grandfather was noted as the greatest rabbi of the Jewish religion. Keep in mind, Gamaliel, as you read about in Acts 22:3, you also see Gamaliel mentioned in Acts 5:34, where he saves the life of the apostles. Remember that. Well, you got a situation where if they were going to go and study at the feet of Gamaliel, well, who's Gamaliel? Well, he's a rabbi, but he's a Pharisee. Okay? Most of you know that the Sanhedrin was the supreme court of the religion of the Jews. Okay? 70-member body, with the 71st member being the high priest. Now, it consisted of two groups, just like our parliament, our House of Representatives, and our Congress. It's Sadducees and Pharisees, and the majority would fluctuate. Historians tell us at this time the Sadducees were the majority. But anyway, he was a Pharisee which believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. But the thing to keep in mind about the Sanhedrin is their cornerstone doctrine was to deny the deity of Christ. That was their mission. So he was a Pharisee, a tremendous teacher of the law. So this is where young Saul of Tarsus is located for approximately 2 years. One other very important point I want to emphasize and try to impress upon us as we study this man, his academic prowess. He was trilingual. Hebrew, we know for sure. Greek, raised in the Greek culture. And you couldn't deal with the Romans if you didn't know Latin. 3 languages. This man is trilingual, very well educated. Now, I mentioned the Sanhedrin and his cornerstone doctrine. Now, he returns home at about age 16, they tell us. And one very interesting point to me, and I'm sure will be to you, he makes his trip back home from Jerusalem back to his home in Tarsus at about age 16. Now, he makes this same journey again, doesn't he? I bring that in, I'm jumping ahead a little bit because I want you to notice the irony of this. About 15 years later, he makes this same journey from Jerusalem to Tarsus, and it's recorded in Acts chapter 9, verses 29 and 30. You want to turn there, please. Acts chapter 9, verses 29 and 30. I like to bring this up because a lot of times by the time we get over and we're studying in Acts 9, sometimes we forget to go back and relate it to the fact he made this journey before. But you know the indications given us in Acts 9, 29 and 30. He had taught at Damascus and they tried to kill him. And then Barnabas helps him get introduced in Jerusalem and they were going to kill him. So the brethren take him, as recorded in Acts 29 and 30. They take him to save his life. They escort him to Caesarea and put him on a ship so he can go back home to Tarsus to safety. So he makes that journey again, and I want to mention that this time because I think it's very interesting. One other thing I want to mention to you is I've got some data here. And again, it's difficult but it's very important when we study this. We go watch an old Western movie, and how many miles was a good day for a wagon train? 10? 12? I believe I've heard it said, well, we'll get 10. We have a really good day, it'll be 12 or 13 miles. Now he's going to make this trip on a sailing vessel. His speed was about 5 knots. That's about 6 miles an hour. So it's taken, by the way, this 50-mile trip, again, we need to start thinking this way for this study. From Jerusalem to Caesarea, that's 50 miles. Okay? How long would it take him to travel 50 miles?
2.5 days.
Huh?
2.5 days.
That's right. 2 to 3 days. They got to camp out. What about tents? They've got to camp out to make the overland trip just to go get the ship. They're going to travel from Jerusalem to Caesarea, camp out a couple of nights. Now they're going to get on a ship. So that took the better part of 3 days. At 6 miles an hour, it's going to take him another 3 days, thereabouts, to get back to Tarsus. Okay? 350 miles. It's going to pretty much consume 6 days, a full 6 days pretty easily. So that's one of the things I want us to try to keep about. And by the way, according to my study here, I've used 5 knots for these voyages. Christopher Columbus, historians tell us his top speed was 8 knots. Unless you're in a gale force wind pushing you, and you go a little faster than it. But it was all the way to March the 24th, 1703, to get a record speed of 12 knots was exceeded by a frigate. Okay? We're going to go slow. We're going to go slow. And that accentuates the need for tents. Now, I think what I'd like to do at this point is to let me go to this next slide. I think this is what I want to show you. Now, we'd like to think about the fact, well, boy, those tents they were needed a long time ago. Oh, is that right? What's this say? What did I found? John Smith in Jamestown. What did he say do? Pitch your tents. Okay, so we don't have to go back 2,000 years. Just go back about 300 or so, and we'll see the importance of tent. And that's why I want to emphasize that, because you can imagine the need for this tent material. So he picked a job with a lot of job security when he took up the craft of tent making. So that's one of the things Jackie and I went down to Jamestown Festival Park. Well, it's been many years ago. But boy, as soon as I saw that, I got to get a picture of this, because this tells us something about tents in our backyard right here in Virginia. Okay, that's an important thing. Your time's about up. I think it's probably a good place to stop, except I want to mention this for you for next week. In addition to your second memory verse, think a little bit this week and study a little bit if you get a chance. He's going back home now, okay? At about age 16. He's going back to Tarsus. What did he do? What did he do for most of the next 10 years before he returns to Jerusalem as reported in Acts 7:15? Huh?
Built tents.
Very likely, Judy, what he did was learn his trade of tent making. Okay? Thank you very much. We dismissed. Okay, Joel.